Hey student fam, Pastor John. I hope you are enjoying your spring break. We wanted to bring you a very special message tonight. It's the very first message that I had a chance to speak in front of our entire congregation. It's a message called Redeem, and it's the message about my journey with Christ. It's my personal testimony. You know, God says in the Bible that we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the power of our testimony. And while this was a very vulnerable moment for me, I know that there's power in it. And I want you, our student family, to know who I am and what God has done for me. So I hope that tonight's message means as much to you as it meant to me to be able to speak forth my testimony. I hope you have a wonderful spring break, and we can't wait to see you again next week. My name is Pastor John, and I'm the student pastor here at Pursuit Church. And we're so glad you're here today. Just couldn't be happier to have you here at Pursuit. Pastor Jordan, as you know, had his baby boy this week. And I think we got a picture there of Hudson Tyler. So Hudson Tyler was born last week at 5:56 p.m., 8 pounds, 12 ounces. A happy baby boy, and I got to see him and hold him a little bit, love on him last night. And it's just awesome. And we're just so thankful for what Pastor Jordan and Courtney do for us here in this church. And if we could, let's just lift them up again in a round of applause for all they do for us. I also want to recognize, before I get started this morning, just so you know who my family is, I first want to recognize my beautiful wife, Jennifer. If you don't know her, she's here in the front row. And Jennifer and I have been married 18 years this year. So that's been awesome. And I want to recognize my children. I think I see them here in the second row. So my oldest daughter is Lake, and she's a rising senior at North Lincoln High School. And my middle daughter is Taylor, and she's a rising sophomore at North Lincoln Middle. And my son Tristan, who's going to be in the 7th grade this year at North Lincoln Middle School. So I wanted to recognize them this morning. The title of my message this morning is Redeemed. And redeemed means to buy or to pay off, to clear by payment. And the reality is that for some weeks now, when Jordan had approached me and asked me to be here with you today, I had planned out a message, and I wrote it and even spoke it to myself several times, and it just never felt right. And the Lord spoke to me over these many weeks, and He said to me that, John, you were meant to speak something much more personal today. And that's what I'm going to do. If you've been here the last few weeks, you've heard Jordan speak about platforms and how sometimes we elevate platforms above the cross of Jesus Christ. And I'm here to tell you this morning that the same thing works when we talk about relationships. And sometimes we raise platforms in our own relationships with our spouse, with our children, with our families. And I want to tell you a story about redemption today. I'm going to tell you a story that, quite frankly, is not going to be easy for me. It'll be easy for you to judge me when I get done today. It'll be easy for you to look at me and say, why does he deserve to be speaking to me today? But I'm going to share openly and honestly with you. You see, the psalmist says in Psalm 107:2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. And today is a story about a man and a woman who lived a godless lifestyle. It's a story about a marriage on the rocks, a relationship on the rocks, a relationship that never had a foundation, and when trouble came, it crumbled. As I speak to you today, I want you to think about three things. I first want you to think about your foundation, because I'm going to tell you something. This message today is not meant for just those who are married in the audience. This is meant for those young people who are about to engage in relationships. This message is meant for those who are newlyweds. It's meant for those who have been married for some time. And it's also meant for those of you who are sitting here today on the brink of divorce, on the brink of disaster. You don't even know what brought you here today. This message is meant for everyone. And as you sit and listen to this, I want you to think about three things. First, I want you to think about where your foundation is. What's the foundation in the relationships in your life? Is your foundation based on sexual attraction? Is it based on finances? Or is it based and founded in God? I want you to also think about where you go when times are troubled, when things get tough. Do you turn to friends? Do you turn to family? Do you turn to some self-help book or a coach or a counselor? Or do you turn to the Lord in prayer? And lastly, I want you to think about the difference in a relationship that is firmly founded in the Lord our God and one where He is just an afterthought, if a thought at all. I want you to take a look at some photos that I compiled and placed for you on the screen. These are photos of me and my wife over a span of 18 years. From the very beginning of our marriage until just a few months ago. And what I want you to think when you look at these photos is I want you internally, I want you to look at these and I want you to tell yourself in which of these we were happy, we were joyful, we were living in the Lord, and the Lord was living in us. And I want you to tell me the ones where we were in turmoil, with fits of rage and jealousy, hatred, disgust for one another. So I want you to look carefully. And what if I told you this morning that in 80% of the photos you're looking at, that we were a marriage doomed, that we were unhappy, that we were living a facade, that we were walking through our daily life, and on the exterior everything looked great, but on the interior it was hell. Would you believe that? Because I'm here to tell you something. Sometimes we look into the lives of another person and we think to ourselves, boy, if I could only have what they have. If I could only be what they are. If she could only be, if my wife could only be like she was, or my husband could only be like him. You see, so many times my wife has told me that she gets approached and people say, I don't know how you guys do it. You have the perfect marriage. The perfect marriage. Well, I don't know about you guys, but there's really no such thing as the perfect marriage, is there? And so today I want to tell you about a marriage that has been perfected through Christ Jesus. I want to tell you a story about two people who didn't know God, who have come to not only know God, but to love God and to follow Him. You know, we'll look at things and believe the grass is greener, but the grass isn't greener. It's real easy when you look into a relationship to say to yourself, well, it's all the other person. It's their fault. If they could just change, if they would be better, then this thing would work. But the fact of the matter is, it's much more difficult to look at ourselves. And we're going to talk about that today. You see, Paul writes in the book of Galatians about the fruits of the Spirit. But conversely, he writes about the acts of the flesh. He says in verses 19 through 21, the acts of the flesh are obvious. He says it's not hard to see when you look into a sinner's life. It's quite obvious what they're doing. You don't have to look very deep or very far. You'll see sexual immorality. You'll see impurity, debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred and discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. And Paul says, I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. You see, my wife and I met in the spring of 1998. I was 24 years old. She was 19, and we met and immediately hit it off, and there was a deep attraction for one another, and before long we were intimate. And within just 8 months, as I sat in a hotel room in North Wilkesboro, I wasn't from North Carolina, but worked for a company that was based here and had been engaged to my wife for only 2 weeks. And as I sat in a hotel room, I received a phone call one night. And she said, John, I'm pregnant. And I'll never forget that call. It was scary, and it changed my life forever. And so imagine being many hours away from your girlfriend when you get this news, and I still had several weeks to complete my training here in North Carolina before I could see her again. But she called and gave me the news, and some weeks later I returned, and we were able to rejoin each other for a short period, and then I needed to move. I had to move away to take my job. I moved to Dallas, Texas. And so we began to plan a long-distance wedding, and 5 months later, in May of that year, May of 1999, we were wed. Nothing fancy. It was a very humble wedding, and we didn't have much of a honeymoon, and the very next day, we moved away. I think we had a 2-day honeymoon. And so we moved to Texas, and there were demons that I was battling from my past. I grew up in a divorced home. My mother and father separated when I was only 2 years old. My mother, who was an awesome lady, but she did everything she could to work for us and provide for us, but she also battled depression, anxiety, and a lot of mental illness, and that led to drinking and drug abuse. So my sister really raised me as a young child. I saw my father, like a lot of kids do, every other weekend and holidays. My father at the time I think he thought he was a Christian. He was not. He was completely focused on materialistic things and wealth and having a good time, and that's just kind of what I grew up under. But one of the things that happened when I was pretty young, went to live with my father at about 12 years old. And one of the things that I was exposed to pretty early was pornography. And, as just a young boy, I began to use that, and that really carried through all through my teenage years and into my adulthood. And so my wife and I, we were married, and I remember very early on in our marriage after we moved, here she is, she's 5 months pregnant. She's dealing with all of these emotions. And we live 10 hours away from the next closest person that we know, so it's lonely. I'm working all the time because just like my father, I'm following in his footsteps. I'm chasing after wealth. I'm chasing after promotions. I'm chasing after things. And she's at home. She's pregnant. She's trying to get a job to work to make ends meet there in our home. And that's how our life began. And I remember really early on in our marriage, only a couple of weeks in, when my wife first caught me viewing pornography, and it was deeply hurtful to her. And for me, I just defended it, right? I just defended it. And so I was very controlling in our marriage early on. I told you I was 5 years her elder. She was fresh out of high school. I controlled every aspect of the marriage. I controlled what we did. I controlled the finances. I controlled everything. And in a lot of ways, I think I treated her more like I was her father than her husband. And so life went on, and Lake was born in October of that year, and it was awesome. And she forever changed our lives. I'll never forget when I saw her that day. She scared me to death. She was purple. But she was awesome, and, it was such a life-changing experience for us. And we began our life as a family. And eventually, you'll kind of get a theme here with my company. I would move about every 2 years, and because of my work ethic and how much I would work and pour into my work, I was very fortunate to be promoted every 2 to 2.5 years. And so you'll see this recurring theme as I go through today. But eventually that led us to Alabama, and we moved to Birmingham, Alabama. And again, we bought our first house there. We were chasing after the American dream. Again, chasing after assets and possessions, and we weren't attending church. We didn't have any relationship with the Lord. We began to talk about having another child, and I think probably the night we talked about it, we became pregnant with Taylor, and Taylor was conceived, and we had Taylor when we lived in Birmingham, and life for us was pretty good in Birmingham. I would tell you that when we were there, I was gone more than I was there. I worked all the time. It was my priority. My priorities were not what my priorities are today. My priorities were work and chasing after my own ambition. So I would work from very early in the morning to very late at night. And I did not spend a lot of time with my family. Really the only times I spent with my family would be on Saturday and Sunday. So 2 years later, we had an opportunity. I was promoted, and we had an opportunity to move to Indiana. And I think this was a really crucial point in our marriage. You see, I had been so controlling through the early years of our marriage that literally my wife was scared to tell me things. And I bet there are husbands and wives in the room today who feel that same emotion, who feel that maybe they're scared to disclose and tell their spouse, the person they're supposed to be closest to, things that they really need. And my wife was scared to tell me things because she didn't want to break the bad news, because she knew that I didn't have patience and I had a temper, and that anything she said to me was going to be an argument. So she wouldn't tell me. And I remember when we would move, we would always be apart from each other for about 2 months at a time. That was the average length of time that I would be away from my family before they could complete the move along with me. So as we made that move to Indiana, I went to put a down payment on a home, and I found out that the money I thought we had in our bank account wasn't in my bank account. And that created a massive issue. And as I called home that day and tried to find out what was going on, my wife disclosed to me that she had to use the money without me knowing to make ends meet at the home when we were living there in Alabama. But she didn't want to tell me that she was taking money from the account to make ends meet because she was afraid of my reaction. And I just remember this being an enormous moment in our marriage where trust was broken. And for the first time ever, it was the first time that Jennifer said to me that maybe we should just seek a divorce. And that was in 2003. We didn't seek a divorce. Somehow we made it through that, and Jennifer and the kids moved with me to Indiana, and somehow things worked out, and somehow we wound up with a house, and somehow God provided the money, even though we didn't know Him. And life was pretty good in Indiana. I mean, I don't want to paint it all as a bad picture. We had great times together, my wife and my family and I. And an awesome thing happened when we were living in Indiana. We began to attend a small church called Fall Creek Baptist Church. And it was just a small church on the outskirts of Indianapolis, and we became really like family there. We felt comfortable from day one. And my wife was saved and baptized in that church. Having grown up with a Mormon background, she was come to know the Lord when we lived in Indiana, and she was saved and baptized. She began to sing in a choir. She won't tell you this, but she has a beautiful voice. But she began to sing in the choir there, and she helped out with the ladies' ministry. And she was doing amazing things. But her husband was just there. I was there. I didn't have a moment with God. I went every Sunday. I attended. I was alongside of her. I supported her. I even interacted in the church and did a few things. But I had no relationship with the Lord. I didn't seek Him on a daily basis. I didn't pray. I didn't read His Word. And whenever I wasn't in His house, I did whatever I wanted to do because that's who I was. So as you can imagine, life's becoming more complicated at this point. We've got 2 children. We're living in a place in the U.S. that was far, far away from where we grew up. I'm continuing to live for myself. I'm continuing to work hard and drive for this ambition, and I'm continuing to use pornography on a somewhat regular basis, and my wife begins to discover this and confront me about it. And of course, just like I did early in the marriage, I defended it. And the arguments became more intense. She was growing up. She was becoming a woman. She was no longer a child. She was gaining her independence. And she was learning that she didn't have to take what I was dishing out. So life was good while we were there, but it was tumultuous. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of back and forth and arguments. And just like always, work came knocking and asked us to move again. It was going to be to a much more difficult area for me. It would mean more work. It would mean I had to pour more into it, but the money was good. So they asked us to move to Atlanta, Georgia, which we did. As I look back on that decision now, it's a decision that ultimately led me here, but it had great cost. You see, my son, Tristan, was born only a week before that move. And as we moved into our home in Atlanta, my son fell very ill with pneumonia. He was only a week old. He was running a very high fever. We took him to the emergency room that night. We didn't even have our boxes unpacked in our house. And we took him in, and they told us he had pneumonia, and it was life-threatening, that they needed to do a spinal tap on him immediately. And we spent the next 7 to 10 days in the hospital with Tristan. As soon as he got out and recovered, I went to work, again, traveling a large territory, working all the time, continuing with my self-centeredness, continuing with achieving the American dream, I guess, wealth and prosperity and all these things. And life now was even more complicated. We had added another child into the mix. And my wife and I, probably like many of you, we were raised differently. So I have one viewpoint on raising children, and she might have another. And you'll see a theme where I talk about that in a bit, where our viewpoints differ on a lot. But you know, life just became more complicated, except when we lived there was something profound that happened. And that was that we began to engage in some relationships that were absolutely toxic. On every level, they were toxic. They drug us down. They introduced us to things that we weren't prepared for. They introduced us to things that we didn't need to be a part of. They introduced us to things that we began to engage in, and it was absolutely toxic. And then, just like always, work came knocking and asked me to move again. And it led us to North Carolina. And we came here to North Carolina in the winter of 2008, and initially we tried a few local churches in the area. And we just never felt at home. But you know, that's what we do as Christians, right? Christians. We would go into a church, and we would judge the church by the music and the seating and the preaching. Never once looking for what matters in the church, which is Jesus Christ. We weren't there for that. We were there to hear, did the music suit our taste? And so, who would have thought? We never found anywhere that we could agree upon that we liked, although we chose 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 churches. Nothing met our expectations. So what did we do? We stepped away from the church again altogether, because that was easy for us. We knew how to do that. And immediately upon stepping away from the church, we began to engage in relationships here that were toxic. It led to, you name it, partying, consuming alcohol, infidelity, you name it, that's what it led to. Destruction. And so we were here, and we thought we were happy. We're living our life. We lived for the weekend. We lived for the party. We lived for Saturday night to recover on Sunday. And that's how we lived our life. Jennifer would tell you that she was after her self-centeredness and what she wanted, and I would tell you that I was after mine. And never once were we after it together. I remember in 2014, things had gotten so bad. Things had gotten so horrible with the the verbal abuse, the mental abuse, back and forth. I remember we had this enormous argument. And we came out of that argument, and I think within a few weeks, I told Jennifer, I said, we need to seek marriage counseling. And she reluctantly said yes. The reality is she wanted no part of marriage counseling. Jennifer was checked out. She would tell you she loved me, but she didn't like me. She would tell you that she had asked many times for me just to be removed from her life. You see, she was scared to leave, and I was scared to leave. And she was asking, just do something. Just take him out of my life. That's how bad it had gotten. That's how I had lived. And so we sought this counseling, right? Not Christian counseling, just counseling. And we went and we sat through the sessions, and Jenny didn't want to be there. And all I was doing was talking about myself. And you want me to tell you how good those counseling sessions did? Zero. Zero. They did no good. In fact, it was probably worse. So we just moved forward like we always did. One day good, 10 would be bad. One day good, 10 would be bad. In 1 Peter 5:8, it's written, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And I'm going to tell you today, he's looking for you to devour. He wants to devour your family. He looks to sift you as if you were wheat. So my wife told me in May of 2015, she gently encouraged me to come here to Pursuit Church. And by gently encouraged, I mean she said, if you don't go, we're finished. And she led me to Pursuit Church in May. I wish I could tell you I was happy to be here that morning. I wish I could tell you I had a great attitude about coming. The fact of the matter is, this is the last place on earth I wanted to be, May of 2015. In fact, we argued on the way here. We didn't sit together that morning. And I didn't want to be here. She had met some friends in CrossFit that had told her about the church, and that's how we got led here. So each week, we would continue to come here and go to church. Most weeks, we would either argue before or after the service. And I can't tell you how many weeks we didn't even drive together to get here. I can remember sitting in this area with my family, with Jennifer on one end and me on the other, because we didn't want to be next to each other. And so we began to come, and the Lord began to do a work. The Lord began to speak to us, and it drew us. And I've heard so many of you say, I don't even know the Lord, but I come here because I feel led here. And that's exactly what happened in my circumstance. We came here because we felt led here. And even though the enemy was trying to tear us apart, we would still get in the car and drive here. And so we were coming, and we had been coming for, 2 months. And I can remember so clearly, I think, Jordan, you were even speaking on relationships at the time. And I remember sitting there and I thought, God, I hope she's hearing this. Like, I hope my wife has her ears open, and I hope she's listening, because she needs to hear that. I would later find out that my wife was sitting in the pew thinking, God, I hope he's listening. I hope he's hearing what you're saying, because he needs to hear that. And we would sit here week after week, and that's exactly what we were thinking. I was thinking, God, if you don't change her, I'm out. And she was thinking, God, if you don't change him, I'm out. But he says it's a roaring lion, and he's looking for somebody to devour. Well, let me tell you how he wanted to devour us. After just 60 days of coming here, it went from bad to worse. See, we think that we can just show up in the church and everything's going to be okay. right? We're going to live our life however we want to live it for as long as we want to live it. We're going to do it the way we want to do it as long as we want to do it. And then when things get so bad that we don't have a way out, we're just going to show up at church, and then God's going to do his thing and everything's going to be all right. Y'all with me? Because that's what we think. But that's not the way it works. You don't just show up in the church and everything's going to be all right. Because I'm going to tell you something, when you show up in God's house, that's when Satan's really going to come after you. That's when he's really going to show up in your life. Because he had me. Why would he want to let me go? He had me. I was his. A puppet. But he showed up. And I want you to know, for the first time, I'm so embarrassed to say this. For the first time in my life, because I'd always told myself growing up in a divorced family that I would never be divorced. Even as a young kid, I used to say that mentally to myself. Like, I'll never divorce my wife. I'll never be split from my wife. Y'all might think I'm lying, but that's true. I used to say that as a young kid to myself. And for the first time, 60 days after we started coming to Pursuit Church, a great friend of ours had a birthday party. And we went to her birthday dinner. And I don't even recall what we were arguing about. It was bad. And I just remember sitting down at the table in front of some friends of mine, and for the very first time verbalizing at a table right in front of my wife that I was done with her. It was over. I didn't care about her anymore. And I was ready to move on. That made for an interesting car ride back home. But that's the truth. That's where I'd sunk in my life. That I thought it was okay to take a precious gift that God gave me and tear her down right there in front of her friends. You see, what I didn't know is that while I was tearing her down, she was asking God to change me. Change him. Just change him. I want you to know something. You have to fight for your family. The devil doesn't want your family to survive. You have to stand up and fight. Satan knows that if he can split the family, he can split the church. And his number one tactic to split the family is division. And that's exactly what Satan tried to do. He tried to divide me and my wife and me and my family. You see, when we began to attend Pursuit Church, he began to attack. When we began to listen to the Word of God, Satan began to scream in my ear. When we began to try to work things out, he said, no, I'm going to work my way back in. Because that's the way that Satan works in our lives. But in Matthew 11, the Lord tells us, come to me, all you who are wearied and burdened. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So then, in that August, we were sitting there. Somehow we managed to make it through to November. And that November morning, we woke up and we had a fight. Because remember, I told you that our foundation was based on attraction and sexual attraction. And so that's what we knew. And so we had a fight that morning, and I remember the genesis of that fight was intimacy. And the fight grew larger and larger, and the mental abuse and the verbal abuse, and we were on the cusp of even physical abuse. That's how bad it had gotten. And that morning in November, at the end of that fight, Jennifer grabbed her keys and she said, I'm leaving the house this morning. And I'm taking the children. And when I get back, I don't ever want to see you. I don't ever want to see you again. And you know, normally, like so many times before, I would have tried to stop her. But I didn't stop her that morning. That morning, she took her keys. She slammed the door. My 3 beautiful children, my wife walked out of my life. And I started to do what I always would do. I started to just go do me, because I was good at doing me. I'd just go to the gym, I'd go to my boat, crack a beer. And that's what I started to do that morning. I got to the foot of my bed that Saturday morning, and I fell down on my knees, and I cried like I've never cried. And I told God that morning, I said, God, I'm not worthy. I don't deserve this. I can't do anything about it. I've made it so bad, I can never get it back. Save me, God. Save my life. Please. And I cried at the foot of my bed, and I cried at the foot of my bed, and I wept. And I asked God to take the addiction away from me. I said, God, if you don't take this addiction away from me, I don't stand a chance. I don't stand a chance. I dishonor everything in my life. And I don't know how long I was there on that floor. But I know this. When I stood up that day, I got the vessel that was tied to my addiction, and I destroyed it that morning. And I've never struggled with that a day since. I've never even had a thought. And when my wife returned home, I don't know why she stayed, but I pleaded with her and I begged her and I told her that I was changed and I'd given my life to Christ, and Christ had filled me in that moment. And I told her I would be different because, see, words are cheap. I'd told her 1,000,000 times before the same thing, but there was a difference this time. This time, I'd asked Jesus to lead. And I remember about a month after that, I asked her, could we sit down? I think it was on a Monday night. And I said, could we have a conversation tonight, just you and I? I got some things I need to tell you. And she agreed, and we met that night, and we sat down, and I began to talk to my wife, and I disclosed every secret that I had ever kept from her. I told her every sin, every addiction, everything I'd ever done. I begged for her forgiveness, and I told her that the Lord had laid on my heart that I couldn't move forward until I laid all of that on the table to her. And an amazing thing happened. She began to speak to me. And she told me things that she had never told me, and we had been married for 16 years. Things that had happened to her in her childhood that devastated her, that I never even knew about, that I was making worse. And would it surprise you if I told you that that night, after 16 years of marriage, that my wife and I had our first real conversation? And that night changed our marriage forever and changed our life forever. Such an awesome thing happened that night. Jennifer began to surrender her life to God. Because Jennifer would tell you that in her life, it was her children and then everything else. God was somewhere down that list, and I wasn't even on it. And I will tell you something. In my life, it was John and then everything else. And Jennifer was way down it, and God wasn't on it before. But see, I think of this like a pyramid with God at the top. And when we began to be honest with one another, and when I surrendered my life to God, He was at the top of the pyramid, and we were on the corners. And she began to seek God, and I began to seek God. And with every passing day, we would seek Him more and more. Reading of His Word and prayer, coming into His house and listening, being honest with one another and loving each other. And over time, as we sought God, an amazing thing happened in our life. We came together. We began to come together because God was in the middle. He wasn't on the exterior anymore. He was clearly in the center. And when He became the center of attention, when He became the center of focus, then we came together. I became second in her life. She became second in my life. Our children elevated in our life. And then everything else. In January of that year, the Lord spoke to she and I and said we should start a Bible study group. We discussed it for a few weeks, and we began to host a Bible study with just a few friends. A life group, if you will. And I want to tell you something. That's what a life group is. People you do life with. We reached out to Billy and Victoria Morris and Ashley and Stephen Brousseau and Greg and Holly Cox, and we asked them if they would join us, and we began to study as couples. And we began to learn, and we began to disclose, and we began to get into God's Word and do it as a life group. And I want to encourage you today, if you don't have that in your life, get it. Find it. Reach out to the people that you're doing life with and let them be an encouragement to you. Study with them, pour into them, and let them pour into you. And we began to do that. And I began to pray, and I began to get this insatiable desire to be in my Bible every day and to learn. And this snowball started to happen in my life, and I craved God every moment. I would wake up in the morning. I would think about Jesus when I woke up in the morning. I would think about Him before I went to bed at night and all throughout my day. And my wife and I would talk about devotionals, and we'd talk about what we read in our Bible. We started to pray together. Can you imagine a couple praying together? And we began to lift each other up and not tear each other down. And this snowball effect began to happen. And in April, the Lord said, John, I want you to walk into the student ministry. And I walked in literally uninvited and sat down in the back. And in less than 2 years, the Lord said, John, you're going to lead that ministry. What? And later as time went on, I began to feel this. I had this desire and this passion for my wife that I do today, and I love her. She's pretty hot. But the Lord said, John, you're going to redo this thing. The first time you didn't get it right, but this time I'm with you. We're going to get it right. I went and bought that lady a ring last August, and last August 1st, I asked her, would she remarry me in a ceremony and renew our vows? And she said yes, which was awesome. So on April 1st, I reproposed to my wife, and she agreed. And on April the 7th of last year, I was baptized right here at Pursuit Church, and never forget how awesome that was. All of my children were baptized. See, my children didn't know the Lord. And through what my wife and I had gone through, my children had come to know the Lord, and they all three were baptized along with me on this stage, and it was one of the greatest honors of my life. And I just can't tell you what that meant to me as a father, watching my children be here. On April the 8th, my wife and I renewed our vows in front of some of you, and we did that and took a second honeymoon, and we've just been on fire for Christ and been on fire for each other ever since. But here's what I want to tell you, that what saved our marriage was not counseling. And what saved our marriage wasn't even walking into the church. What saved our marriage was becoming an open and willing vessel to surrender our lives to Christ. When we surrendered our lives to Christ, Christ stepped in, He took control, and that's when our lives changed forever. And I'm so grateful for what Jesus did on the cross and how He died for my sins so that I don't have to be ashamed to stand in front of you today to tell this story, because this is a shameful story, but I'm not ashamed, because I'm telling you, what God's got planned for me and my wife and our life is amazing. And He'll take yesterday's test and He'll turn it into a testimony. And He'll take your old broken story and He'll use it for His glory, not for yours. And in Galatians 5:24, it is written that those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passion and desires. And I want to let you know, when you accept the Spirit of God in your life, that is true. He will crucify the flesh and its desire. And He did in my life, and He will in yours. But you have to follow some things. Number one, you have to truly surrender your life to Him. You're not capable. You can't do it on your own. You don't have enough willpower. You can't will your way through it. You can't fake your way through it. You can say 1,000 times, I'm going to change tomorrow. You will never change until the Spirit of God enters your life, period. So you have to first come to a moment where you're so broken that you surrender. Number two, you have to ask to receive the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and self-control. You have to pray that prayer. He says in Matthew 7, if you will ask, seek, and knock, you will find. But you have to ask. He says, I'm here. I'm waiting, son. I'm waiting, daughter. Come to me. You have to seek God daily as an individual and as a couple. You can't just be in it by yourself. You got to be seeking Him on your own, and you got to be seeking Him with your spouse. You better learn to die to yourself, because see, it's not about you. Just like when we're here and we're in God's place, it's not about us. It's about Him. And in your marriage, it's not about you. It's about her. And it's not about Him. You got to forgive. If you can't forgive, you can't move forward. See, the Lord tells us that we cannot be forgiven until we give forgiveness. So you've got to expose it. You've got to crucify it. And there's got to be forgiveness. And when you forgive, you build your foundation on the only thing that will stand, and that is the rock. The rock of Jesus Christ, the rock of His Word. And I just feel like there are so many here today that are in young, blossoming relationships. Or maybe you just got some news like I got in North Wilkesboro that night. I think there are relationships that are in this room today where the kids are in between and the spouses are on either end, and you didn't want to be here this morning. And the Lord just wants you to know that there's a different way. There's a better way. Because the Lord teaches us in Matthew, He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, and it beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But He also says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a fool who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, and it beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. My house is built on rock. My house will not fall. I'm going to ask you today, what is your house built on? What is your relationship built on? What are you seeking after today in this moment? Are you seeking after yourself? Are you seeking after that sexual desire? Are you seeking after finance and wealth? Are you seeking after your own selfish heart? Are you dying to yourself? Are you putting someone else ahead of you? And are you literally being the love that Christ poured out for us on that cross? And I pray today for you that if you're in this room and you're broken and you're trying to figure out how you're going to make it that next day, that next moment, that next year, I want to encourage you to lay it at the altar this morning. You crucified at the altar the sins of the flesh. The Lord doesn't care what your background is. He will use anybody. He will take you and He will turn you into a vessel, and He will make you powerful, and He will give you the words to speak, and He will make your testimony so powerful that people's lives change because of it. So I want to invite you. I want to invite you to join me in prayer this morning. And if you're hurting, if you need healing this morning, you give it to God, and He will change your life forever and ever and ever and ever. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight to hear this very special message. We're so glad that you're a part of our Pursuit student family, and we want to remind you to go and follow us on Instagram at pursuit.students. And also, if you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, be sure to do that right now. We'll see you again next week.